All right. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody from wherever you're listening to this. I'm very delighted to be hosting this session with very fantastic panelists here and in partnership with the Young Professionals and Foreign Policy Tokyo chapter. As you already know, the topic we have today is a very interesting one. But from the perspective of the next-gen global frontier, we'll try to tackle this problem from the international law perspective, from the public policy perspective, and also from a leadership point of view. And so just to give a brief introduction about the next-gen global frontier, this is an international organization of emerging leaders in international law, development policy, and individuals actually working towards collaborating with people who have technology ideas, social entrepreneurship ideas, to work towards closing the gaps between the promise and practice of international law and development objectives. Why does my saying like a broad definition of what the organization looks like? I think I'll try to break it down. What do we do in 3 basic words? We lead multidisciplinary engagement at the intersection of international law, development, and sustainable development. We advance social impact with responsible leadership to close the gap between the promise and practice of international law and development objectives. And a lot of that you hear today, but we'll try to simplify it so that our audience can understand what we mean by these big terms and definitions. And the very last one, which also speaks to the very essence of this conversation today and the topic that we have, is that we position the next generation of global figures at the intersection to lead conversation, not only in terms of the debate as we're doing now in international law and sustainability issues, especially the one on climate change. So the very topic we have today is climate resilience and sustainable development, redefining youth leadership for the next generation of global frontiers. And this topic essentially speaks to the fact that while we understand that the world today looks to the United Nations for solutions to complex problems everywhere, from defending human rights to fighting climate change, to resolving conflicts as we have seen or we're currently witnessing with the Russia's war in Ukraine. The world also needs some new sort of leadership from young people who are the next generation of decision makers to think about and to get prepared on the next generation of issues affecting our society from the very moment that we are now. And so this topic not only speaks about youth leadership within the context of climate resilience, but how do we redefine youth leadership? And as I mentioned earlier, the next gen puts together young people from international law space. So we have a conversation around what is the international law on climate change today? What is the perspective on policy on climate change and climate resilience? And what is the leadership that we as young people need to take to be able to get prepared for the next generation of development crisis, as we already know? So I'd like to do a very brief introduction of myself. My name is Dami Lola, as the founder of the Next Gen Global Frontier. And I also do an Erasmus Mundus program in international law of global security, peace and development, and specialized in international economic sustainability and governance. But even more important than that is that I am also a youth policy leader with the United Europe, which is a strong think tank here in Hamburg that does some policy research and engagement with public and private sector individuals on also key sustainability issues around energy, climate, and sustainability. And very briefly, I have very interesting panelists here with me. I'll start with a very brief introduction of Razi. Razi Emenidine is also an international law scholar in the Erasmus Mundus program in international law of global security, peace, and development. He's a Lebanese lawyer. And at the moment, Razi is calling in from Belgium. So we have the privilege to have a call from Belgium today, which is in the person of Razi. We also have the privilege to have a call from Singapore, which is from the person of Tavis. Tavis sits on the board of the Next Gen Global Frontier and is also a sustainability professional, and also recently got selected to the Global Shapers Hub in Singapore. So we are very pleased to have you, Tavis. And the very last panelist we have here is Estella. Estella is also a member of the Erasmus Mundus Master's Program in International Law of Global Security, Peace and Development. She's currently volunteering at the local conference of youth here in Germany. So we have a call from Belgium, from Singapore, and also from Germany. These are key global players. And very interestingly, we're here speaking to people in Japan, Japan being also a critical player when it comes to sustainability and international development. So we're very pleased to have this call and to also entertain your questions. And beyond having an academic conversation, this won't be an academic conversation, trust me. We want to get it very engaging and lively and to, get interesting questions and follow-ups afterwards. So I think at this point, I'll give each one of our speakers an opportunity to briefly introduce themselves and, maybe their expectations from this session. So I'll start with Razi.
Thank you very much, Dami. It's a pleasure to be with you. I thank the NextGen Global Frontiers and the YPFP for this invitation. I really appreciate, as you mentioned, the international settings of this panel, as it reflects the true international scope and perhaps the breadth of this the subject across different paradigms and through the entire globe. So I believe, I hope it will be a fruitful session. I'm looking forward to hearing all your insights. So again, thank you very much. And that's it on my end.
Thank you very much, Tavis. Very good to have you. I mean, Razi, very good to have you. And then I'll move to Tavis, please.
No, thanks for having me. And it's really good to see everyone. I'm calling in from Singapore. It's about 3 in the afternoon now, and it's a great pleasure to be joining all of you here. My name is Tavis. I'm currently doing a master's in public policy at the Nippon School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. I wear a couple of hats in Singapore. So as Demi has mentioned, I'm on the board of NextGen with the Global Shapers in the Singapore Hub. I also was part of the Global Policy Diplomacy and Sustainability Fellowship. And a couple of us at YPFP is also a part of. And I also do some work in the public sector, and now I'm with the Heinrich Foundation in international trade. So that's currently my background, and I'm really happy to have this conversation. In Singapore, a lot of my work also focuses on youth empowerment. So I also work with Honor Singapore, and that would come up in conversation later on as well. But the focus really is, for me at least, in just on the topic of sustainability, but in intergenerational dialogues surrounding sustainability for the previous generation and the current youths as well. So I'll leave it as that first. And back to you, Demi. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Tavis. Then we give the floor to Estela to introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Estela Chavez. I'm from Mexico, and I'm a colleague from Damilola and from Razi in the same program currently in Erasmus Mundus. And I'm very happy to be here with you today. I am a lawyer from Mexico, but I also had the opportunity to study international relations, and I also have background in cybersecurity and management skills. Among many other strengths that I will be happy to share with you today, because one of the most important things that as youth we have to do is like be versatile and flexible. Like we cannot frame ourselves in just one role because our society needs us in many. So I'll be happy to tell you a little bit more of this in advance, and I'm just happy to start this with you today. Thank you, Dami.
Yes, thank you very much, Estela, for that introduction. After this round of introduction from our very fantastic panelists, I'm sure you're very excited to get into the topic, climate resilience and sustainable development. How do we redefine youth leadership for the next generation of global frontiers? And to put this very briefly into context, all right, we know that the climate crisis is not only a crisis that is affecting our world now. We have the example of Pakistan, an example in several other countries, with also the heat wave sometime in Europe, and also with energy crisis currently going on as a result of Russia's war in Ukraine. We know that there's a lot going on now, but how do we actually think about these issues from the long-term perspective, right? That is the essence of the frontier behind it, the next generation of global frontiers. Because if COVID has taught us any lesson at all, is that we need to be prepared for disasters. And at any moment, the biggest disadvantage to us as young people is that we need to be able to respond to these challenges right now and also prepare for the future. So without taking much of our time, I think I'll begin with this first speaker. The first speaker, Razi, would be speaking to us about a very interesting topic. And this is about how do we advance the objectives of the Declaration on Children, Youth, and Climate Action. So Razi will speak about this very briefly within the context of the question which I would ask very soon. But Razi, just give us a brief introduction to this declaration. There's a declaration on children, youth, and climate action. What is the importance of this declaration? And bearing in mind that we're speaking to non-international law people, how do we bring this international law framework to their understanding as it relates to climate resilience and development? The floor is yours, Razi.
So first of all, thank you very much. The declaration on the children, youth, and climate action is a declaration that was initiated in 2019 during COP25 in Madrid by a group of young world leaders and activists, what they called a historic moment to sign such an intergovernmental declaration. Basically, it tries to frame the environmental issue as aside from the other framings that it has as a human rights issue, and in particular a children and youth rights issue. It gained a lot of political momentum during the COP25, perhaps reflecting the political attractiveness, as for instance, if you rewatch how the COP25 went through, while they were announcing the declaration to the COPs, the Convention of Parties, Sweden, for instance, rushed and declared that it will sign the declaration while it was being announced. But unfortunately, after the COP25 perhaps has been folded, we didn't see new signature, again, perhaps reflecting how political attractiveness of these initiatives would vary. So by signature, I mean states that willingly, voluntarily sign this declaration as in adhere to it, but if I may reflect later on the binding legal value of the signature, perhaps that would put things into a more humbling and less over-optimistic approach.
Yes, so, thank you very much, Razi.
Thank you.
I think the very next question to that is, people are already wondering, what is the importance of this declaration? And so my question to you is, the Declaration on Children, Youth, and Climate Action, is this just a mere aspiration or an actionable proclamation? How important is this declaration? Speak to us more about that. You just laid the background to that.
So, yes. First of all, as a declaration, it wouldn't have a binding legal value on the international community per se, as one would expect. Even on the signatories, it doesn't adhere to specific, for instance, obligations that are particularly defined. It reframes the climate crisis in a youth and children manner. Now, why, we might ask ourselves, why children and youth? It states that in the preamble, it first states that children face heightened and specific risks due to climate change, as in perhaps the biological vulnerability of children would make them more susceptible to climate risks and perhaps diseases, in health burdens. And then it frames young people as the people with a critical role as agents for change in climate action. Perhaps I'd like to add one more reason, perhaps unspoken for an obvious reason, is that a lot of the inattention towards the climate change crisis by a lot of societies is the mere fact that statistically speaking, perhaps a lot of or majority of people would outlive the climate crisis if you don't consider it to be like we're currently living in it, which is again a false perspective. But the youth and children in particular are the people most expected to suffer from the climate change crisis in the future. Now, it reaffirms the role of these sections of society in creating policies, national and regional and perhaps international framework in the future without putting binding obligations. It perhaps refers to the Paris Agreement in terms of the obligations on the member states, and we all know how the Paris Agreement's obligations are also drafted in a broad manner that wouldn't put particular specificities on the state. But then again, perhaps that's a reasonable outcome to foresee, as we've seen a lot of international law binding instruments, hard law, that's not respected by states, in contrast to perhaps a soft law normative approach, which this declaration tries to adhere, an ethical value, perhaps a normative manner in which states should voluntarily implement children and youth-centered climate policies. And with that, I'd leave us with perhaps more substantive international legal instruments, which is the UN General Assembly resolution that was later adopted. After this declaration, it was adopted on 26 July 2022. It had a more substantive number of signatories. It was more widely expected on the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This is perhaps an evolution into, again, a human rights paradigm, giving a human rights approach to what was traditionally a state-centric approach, as in states would sovereignly decide on their legal instruments. And I think this is a very positive evolution of this pressing, urgent issue, and we hope that this evolution wouldn't take too much time. And thank you very much. I really believe that giving a human rights paradigm to such pressing issues would make it more achievable and more feasible in the future.
Yes, thank you very much, Razi. I think the bottom line of what Razi has said is that the international law sets the stage for action on climate change. All right. And as we know, I think a lot of people might know the Paris Agreement, as Razi mentioned. There's a lot of international law frameworks out there that try to globalize this idea and challenge that we face today. So to basically bring state parties together to think about this issue, right? The Declaration on Children, Youth, and Climate Actions mentioned that children and youth are very vulnerable to the issue of climate change. And the question is, how do we act upon these key provisions within this declaration? I think that has always been the challenge. While we'll come back to that, I want to quickly move to Tavis, because part of our topic today speaks on climate resilience, which speaks to the fact that we not only need to tackle present challenges, but also put in place infrastructures that would help us tackle emerging challenges in the future. So Tavis, having a background in public policy, just speak to us very quickly on this topic of delivering youth-led innovation and policy for climate-resilient infrastructure. I'll start with a question for you so that you can also lay a background and answer the question. The first question to Tavis is that ahead of COP27, what is the role of youth in the co-creation of policy and innovation for climate-resilient infrastructure? The floor is yours, Tavis.
Thanks, Emmy. Okay. So when I was thinking about this question, and we think about the role of youth in policy making, oftentimes they're absent. Absent because you don't find youths at the table writing policy, right? We find them in schools, we find them in dialogue sessions to get feedback on policies that are already created. So oftentimes it's hard for us to specifically figure out what the roles of youth are in policy making, specifically making policies to create a more resilient future, because that's the role of policymakers, which is also why there's a lot of grievances, right? It comes from youth themselves, because they're not part of the process, yet they either suffer the consequences or they benefit from what's been made by policymakers. So then, to answer your question ahead of COP27, what then is the role of youth in this co-creation process? And I mentioned this at the start, right? That building this climate resilient future is one that is an intergenerational challenge. And that requires an intergenerational conversation and collaboration to begin addressing these challenges. And I guess to me, the nature of this intergenerational conversation and challenge means that youths have become so important in this conversation, because in the intergenerational contract, it's a contract between the various generations, right? How do we allocate resources? How do we allocate public goods? How do we distribute them or redistribute them? How do we rethink our global social contracts? And this is also important because most of the solutions that are going to be implemented are going to affect our generations, right? The ones that see it through. So the future must be co-created with the voices of youths, amplified to ensure an equal stake in a more equitable distribution of these resources and of these public goods. And I think that many of us are extremely invested, and that's truly a wonderful thing, right? But to contribute constructively, I do genuinely believe that we need to play our part in a more conscientious and valuable way. One of the things I've been thinking about lately is that we need to go beyond this general perspective that if I'm making some critiques or if I'm making some noise within my community, that's sufficient. Because I think to have a seat at the table in this co-creation of policies and innovation, we need to demonstrate that we know what we're talking about, right? And I think this can be done in 4 ways in which youths can better themselves. And really quickly, the first is to get equipped. So get equipped in terms of knowledge, understanding, and shortcomings in your own local issues, right? Because this is going to differ across countries, across cities, across communities. You can know your stuff, know what has been done, know what to avoid, and know what the potential next steps might look like. So equip yourself, right? The second is to get involved. Right? So walk around, understand the needs of the local community, understand how these needs might differ across communities. So when you look at the policies in place, you can see the trickle-down effects, right? Get engaged, right? So know your stakeholders, go beyond advocacy and work with stakeholders to take action. Don't just wait around and hope to see change, right? Get engaged and make the change happen. And finally, is to get invested. And invested, I think what I really mean by this is that we need to feel like we have a stake in this fight for a sustainable future, because the climate is not in crisis, right? Humanity is in crisis. The climate is changing. And more often than not, this idea of investment comes from our own individual perspectives and how we view ourselves in relation to the world around us. If we're serious about co-creating policies, we need to invest our time and energy, and by doing so, we'll begin to feel a bit more invested. So just to wrap this up, right, at the heart of it, it's the basic principle, I think, of taking responsibility and exemplifying responsible leadership. And if youths are able to get equipped, involved, engaged, and invested, I think we'll be well positioned to engage and collaborate effectively and constructively across the various generations.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Tavis, for that. I think the bottom line of what Tavis has mentioned is that a lot of times young people are in other settings when policies are being made on their behalf. These are things that affect our collective future as young people. But essentially, how do we try to do more to ensure that our perspectives are being taken into account when policies are being made by government officials? This is a very difficult challenge across continents. And I think one thing that would actually take us beyond the current situation that we are is to, as Tavis mentioned, beyond advocacy, how do we find other platforms of engagement with our public policy officials? Because essentially, this topic doesn't only speak about policy, but also innovation. So as a young person, if you have an enterprise solution to a climate challenge in your environment, how do you try to marry that innovation with the policy that your government has to be able to create, to be able to bridge that implementation gap in the policy objective of the government? One final thing I'll say before I leave the floor to Estella is that we all know currently that all countries have national determined contributions, right? Within the national determined contribution, which is what would each country do to solve this problem of climate change, there's a need for young people to be able to think about enterprise solutions and initiatives. That's where innovation comes in, to be able to transform these NDCs into investment plans by way of your innovation to solve the challenge in the society. I think that's the next thing that Tavis' question would go back to. But very quickly, let's quickly go down to Estella. Estella will be speaking to us about youth capacity and preparedness to tackle future development crisis. So I'll start with this question for you, Estella. Given the lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic on disaster preparedness, what is the role or step that young people should take in the planning and preparatory process for tackling future development crises? Seems like a long question, but I'm sure she's very competent to tackle that question. The floor is yours, Estella.
Thank you, Dami. Well, let's start with placing ourselves in the correct place. What is this? We know, like in a cliche way, that the youth, it's in the middle of the children, the childhood, and the adulthood, and the elderly people, right? So this makes us a bridge, literally make us the generation that connects, and it's able to identify what the children need and what we see that we're gonna need in the future. And that will help the adults and elderly people in positions of power and representations to represent us in the correct way. Nonetheless, what have we seen in many places in the world? We are not being correctly represented. And this creates spaces for what? For participation. But how do I do it? If I detect that my needs are not being, they're not being attended, or they're not being attended like in the way that I would like, what can I do? So first, we should identify what are the institutions, like our local institutions, that can help us, or that are trying, or that are effectively or constantly or consistently trying to do a change in the area that we are identifying that needs to be tackled. Second, institution of what type? It can be governmental or even academical institutions. As you can see, our schools, universities, or college, or if you are younger and if you're still in high school, these are platforms for us to not only get the knowledge that we academically need for have a future degree, but also to inform us about what is happening in our current world. As Razi gave us an introduction for the International Convention on Human Rights and how children and youth are involved in this, we can also know that awareness, it is a topic that is often not taught. What is this? We need to be aware, we need to know who we are, where we are, and what we stand for. If you and your communities, many of you right now joining LCOY Japan, what are the characteristics of your community? What are the things that you are going through? Because it's not the same that someone probably in Europe is going right now, someone from Eastern Europe, and it's not the same as Asia. Apparently the conflicts are different, but in the basic, we all want the same. We all want a sustainable development, which means we want a healthier, happier, integrated life. So for this, what are the challenges that the pandemic taught us? We need technology, right? If I don't have the access to it, I'm probably left behind. So what can I do? Approach the community and say, like, we need more capacitation to our youth in technologies. Oh, but some people don't even have access to these kind of resources. Well, here it goes, right? Here is where we can participate to start to account this accountability. What do we have and what do we need? And I would recommend you to, if the institutions that you don't have, as mentioned by Dami and Tavis, are not enough, this creativity, then look for other young people as you and engage and commit to a purpose. A joint purpose is the most important thing. When our voices are not being heard, what we have seen in the world is that we have created spaces, especially through social media, but then bringing all these movements in social media to a local effectivity or international level. We have the power and we have the voice, and we can be the voice for those that are not ready yet to speak up. That they are not ready doesn't mean that they don't have something to talk about. So if we can identify this, we can commit to this mission of being a bridge. So this is the first part of answering to this question, Dami, and then I'm gonna go maybe more specifically to the key points that we can apply for this.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Estella. I think you raised a lot of points, but you, more importantly, tried to set the stage for us as young people. So we find that there's a lot of challenge, right? But one thing that Estella mentioned that's very relevant in terms of social media is that how do we take our message online to have offline effect? if anyone is going to leave this panel with something, it's that statement from Estella. How do we take this conversation from online to people offline? This message is very important. And she spoke very briefly also about planning and preparation. I think for anyone to be able to plan, first of all, we need to have clarity on the issues that we're facing, right? Of course, we know we are all aware of this challenge in the society. But how do we do this? By creating a new level of awareness, by creating new ideas and directions for us as young people to go. And that's clearly what we're doing here today in partnership with the young professionals with foreign policy. And I'm sure you all we all agree with that. But to take this conversation further, and I'm sure our audience are also noting down some of their questions for the panelists already, we'll have a separate time for questions and answer. But to move on to the next round of questions for our panelists, this is where they'll give us very specific examples as relating to the topic and as relating to the theme for today's panel session. In this case, I'll start with Tavis. You spoke to us about the role of youth in the policy and innovation co-creation space, right? Can you give us some case studies in this regard? Because young people are interested in developing solutions and policy innovations for climate resilient infrastructure within the society. So what examples can they look at? If you are able to point to one or two for us, I'll be very appreciated. The floor is yours, Tavis.
I have 5. Okay. When I was going through the different projects, and when we think about youth's role in co-creating these policies, I mean, it's best to find them in the actual stuff that we do on the ground in the communities around the world, right? If you want structural change, oftentimes it will take a long time to come. The advice that we get, that we give to youth, right, is just go do it, right? Experiment, try, fail, try again, and figure out what works. So if we take a look around the world of the various youth-led projects, it's actually quite inspiring and quite remarkable. In different parts of the world, there are youths who are leading a charge in their own local communities to directly address some of the issues that they face. And in this examples that I'm going to share, because I recently joined Global Shapers, and I'll cite some examples from there because I think they did quite good work, and pretty recent as well. And if you guys are interested, it's quite easily Googleable, so you can go search it up. So for a quick context, the Global Shapers community was born out of the World Economic Forum. It's a network of young folks under 30 to address local, regional, and global challenges, right? So in the lead up to COP27, also why it's relevant to this, the Global Shapers community partnered with the Climate Reality Project to design a youth climate action challenge, hosted by the World Economic Forum to support and empower 9 innovators in their projects around the world. I thought these are good examples because it shows that the diversity and the tangibility as well. Just to name a couple. The first, it's this project called Blue Power from India. It's a micro hydro solution providing reliable and resilient hydropower that's compact and easy to install in rivers and canal sites, currently unfit for electrification. So again, targeted issue, targeted solution. The second is from Ghana, it's Eco Smart Framing. It's a project called Eco Smart Framing, the Eco Warriors. Essentially what they do is it's a digital framing solution that offers climate smart agriculture practices to farmers in local languages. And this is scalable, and it's based on exactly what the community needs because they're losing rice crops due to climate change, and they require new climate smart methods of rice farming. The third example is in Portugal. It's called Mudatuga. It's a startup creating domestic and community compost solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and prevent the disposal of organic waste in landfills, right? So this initiative addresses Portugal's growing urban waste problem while aiming to be a catalyst of circular waste management within the peninsula. And just last 2 really quick one. In Azerbaijan, it's called Hamza Recycling, which is a social startup that uses textile and plastic waste to create shoes and clothing. So essentially they aim to create products designed specifically for people with disabilities from recycled materials. And so they realize that people with disabilities have been underrepresented in the fashion industry, and hence recycling is contributing to both sustainability and inclusiveness, right? And finally, within Asia, there's Tree Square. That's a scalable model for urban reforestation supported by the Philippines Department of Environmental and Natural Resources. Important here because there's a collaboration between both public and private, right? So the project combats climate change 1 square meter at a time, right, through collective and individual action to regreen their cities of sorts, to replant these trees. And they do have a target of achieving 10,000 square meters of urban tree coverage across 100 cities in the Philippines. And they can scale this potential to other Southeast Asia countries. But closer to home in Singapore, an example would be how Next Gen Global Frontier recently partnered with Green Check, right? It's a local youth-led climate justice organization, as well as a large organization called the Club of Rome for Thought Leadership webinar at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And I'm part of the Honor Champions group on sustainability in Singapore. And we essentially collaborate with young leaders from the Singapore chapter of the St. Gallen Symposium. And essentially we seek to amplify the message of sustainability driven by honor. So in short, I think there are many ongoing projects around the world where youth have been leading the change in the local communities. But some similarities across all of it is that Demi is extremely right? They do have clarity in the issue that they're trying to solve. And they do have some sort of passion for the problems. They're well-funded and resourced by going out there, pitching their ideas, working with stakeholders, and trying to deliver some sort of solution tangibly to the ground. So yeah, I think these are some examples that hopefully would also inspire youth from around the world. And I guess just to wrap this all up as well, the reasons why I gave these 5 examples is to show the level of diversity as well as reach that these projects have. There is a level of innovation and creativity, a level of localization. I think we're able to deliver some real impact and move from all talk to action, right? From the online to the offline space. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Savis, for reiterating that point. How do we move online message to offline? And how do we bring this objective from promise to practice? And I'm sure our audience will agree with us that this is why we have spoken about the international law perspective. This is why we've spoken about the policy, but also more importantly, also speaking about what innovations can young people create to solve or reverse the challenge of climate change within their communities. I think our audience would be very interested in having a look at some of these initiatives that I mentioned, because they're diverse across the world, from Ghana, from Portugal, and also the example in Singapore. I think this is very, very, very important. So just to move very quickly now to Razi. Razi, the question to you is, within the Declaration on Children, Youth, and Climate Action, what are the actionable pathways or provisions within this declaration upon which new climate action should be based? So you spoke to us about this declaration. So some of us really want to know, what are the key provisions within this declaration upon which we can make or lead new climate action? Please, the floor is yours, Razi.
So the declaration, perhaps in the manner of speaking and how the question was phrased by word, it does not have, or at least it does not seem to have, actionable pathways on which some renewable activities or climate actions should be based. This is perhaps a bit more technical aspiration than what the declaration is trying to achieve. It does not perhaps put positive obligations and ipso facto no technical obligations on the signatories, and perhaps one might argue not even any obligations on the signatories to achieve climate practices. Perhaps the only technical climate practices that the declarations mentioned was in the Paris Agreement, and perhaps in the annexes of the declaration, it made further references to how the Paris Agreement initiates the importance of achieving, in particular, a global average temperature below 2 degrees Celsius, and to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So I think in terms of did the declaration put positive technical obligations or any obligations at all on the very limited number of signature, I think the answer would be negative. However, perhaps the aim of the declaration was not to put positive obligations on the first place. It was perhaps to reaffirm pre-existing, more normative approaches towards the relationship between human rights and human centrism and international legal environmental policy. as mentioned by Travis, I really found a very reasonable connection between what you mentioned as honor-driven sustainability or action. So I think that's what the declaration is trying to achieve, some degree of ethical concern while pursuing climate policy. Perhaps this normative approach might be even of a higher value in terms of international discourse than the traditional black letter law approach. I think in that manner, it can also perhaps drive forward the evolution of international law as I've previously mentioned. And while we cannot claim that there's enough, not to drive too technical too fast, but there's not enough state practice and opinio juris, which are the constitutive elements of customary international law, to forcibly claim that there is a customary international law that binds states in terms of the youth and children-driven climate action and human rights. We can always say that this further internationalization of this concern is always mobilizing, is always evolving, and we can expect further evolution in that regard. Perhaps as a concern that I might raise finally is we should not interpret the youth policy and youth and children perhaps centricism as an us versus them mentality, as many perhaps would like to claim that it is us, the youth, who are the victims, and them, the other generations, who are the perpetrators, and we are suffering what they are committing. So this mentality, while it's natural in psychology, there's the social identity theory put forward in the early 70s and 80s by Henry Tajfel, professor of psychology, specialized in social identity, as in group A and group B, and humans instinctively try to divide themselves in group. This is not perhaps the objective of saying we as youth are interested. It's perhaps to further balance the plane and promote representation of youth, as Estella mentioned, as well as perhaps trying to say that we're all in this together, we're all suffering together, we're all victims together. Nevertheless, there are some that are perhaps more vulnerable, less represented, and might have a higher role. So I think that would be a more rational approach in terms of what we can expect on one hand, and what we should be, or what the narrative should be revolving around on the other hand. Thank you.
Wow, thank you very much, Razi, for that. I think Razi mentioned very key points. And I tried to note them down with three main things. The first one is that this international law gives us a sense of direction. What goal do we want to achieve? And serves as the ethical foundation upon which climate action should be based. And also an opportunity upon which new international laws can be built in the very near future. And as we know, as next generation of decision makers, one of our primary goals is to begin to think about what would the SDGs look like beyond 2030? I think having a conversation like this, and I'm looking for the loopholes in the existing international law, can help us reframe this international law frameworks and suggest better solutions that can work in the future. Because if we think about the SDGs, there were MDGs before SDGs, and who knows what would come after the SDGs, you know? So this is a very important conversation that we need to begin to think about. Since we know the loopholes in the current existing international framework, how do we find new solutions that can work for the future? And the very last point that Razi mentioned, which is very important, is how do we move from victimhood to responsibility? I think it's very important. As young people, we can blame others for the situation we're currently in, but let's move from that victimhood mindset to responsibility. As we have seen, the international law sets the stage for action, the policy and the examples have been given in innovation, and then we now go down to Estella. The very last question to you, Estella, that our audience are eagerly waiting to hear your response, as you mentioned previously, is that what are the key areas that the present generation of leaders, what key areas should they prioritize to strengthen youth action and leadership for tackling future development crises like climate change? So we'd like you to put this in the context of climate change. What expectations do we have from the present generation of leaders as the next generation of leaders to empower them in action and leadership for tackling this crisis? The floor is yours, Estelle.
Thank you, Rami. Thank you, Dami. I would like to retake the point that was mentioned just right now briefly by Dami and by Rasi. Like, we need to get out of this victim mindset, right? And I was mentioning before, and we all have mentioned awareness. We need to know where we're standing. And this involves recognizing that climate change, if we have a concept of it, like, it's affecting us all. If I don't have a concept of it, where can I get it, right? We need to be aware of not only our needs, but our privileges. Just the fact that you're like joining this means that you have the opportunity to have access to the internet. And by having access to the internet, you have access to an immense, vast, and profound source of knowledge. And most of them are actually proved, right? But also we need to recognize that not all of these sources are true or valid and accountable. But if we don't know any of this, like many questions in young people is like, I know that there are many things happening, but I also don't know how to do it. It's as easy as to type it out, right? Like, what are the main things that do this? What are the main resources for this? The main platforms? There are trustable ways to do it. So first, you need to know that international law recognizes your obligations and rights, but also gives you the responsibility to know what is this and what can you do about it. And either you do something or you do nothing. We have this on us. So what can we do? Look about it. Oh, I don't like to do it on my own. Look for these forums, right? There are many forums and organizations that are trying to teach our youth about how they can get involved, because involvement requires like knowledge and informed knowledge. And it's not just getting the information, it's processing it in a way that will make you create an impact. This impact can be, oh, because I know that climate change is so important now I'm focusing a career on this. Okay, maybe I am not changing my career because I don't think that climate change is related with software development. It's not. Where are the batteries coming from, right? Like, if you don't know that the natural resources have been extracted from communities that have been exploited and are being exploited, we'll have an impact on it. So by knowing all these tiny things, you can know, like, okay, but maybe my action is small, it won't make a huge difference. Everything we consume as individuals has an impact. We have a carbon print, right? But it's like this sum of everything we consume and do has an impact in the environment. So just by knowing this, we can start having a more daily aware life of what do I consume? Where is this coming from? Do I really need all this energy? Oh, do I leave my computer plugged all the time, or my chargers? We have so much power in so many ways, not just as humans, but in the energies that we are creating and that we are consuming. And we need to be aware of this, right? So if we want to communicate this to an institution, what do we need as youth? We need training, support, and resources, right? Okay, as community, like, for asking for training, support, and resources, what do I need to have? I need to have accountable information and knowledge. I need to prove that I know what I'm talking about. How can I do this? Through my educations, like regular traditional academical institutions, or through self-development, through media, right? It can be the different platforms as Coursera, edX, or even your universities may have, or your communities, free access to different platforms. right? Prioritize safety and happiness, right? We all want to feel secure enough to feel happy, but also for having this, we need to be open, dynamic, and as I mentioned many times, accountable, right? It's not just about having ideas, but it's like bringing up to a forum with people and commit to create a change. And then there's this like be restless, flexible, and innovative, right? Like we have this as young leaders. Even if you consider that you're not a young leader, just by joining this session today, it is showing that you care about your community. Even if you only care about your small group, or if you're interested in international law, you are already like a step ahead. So if you're understanding something of what is in here, transmit it. Give this information to someone that doesn't have it. We believe that information, it cannot be something if it's not written. But actually, that's the power of the loops in international law. When something is not strictly prohibited or is not strictly mentioned, it gives us the opportunity to create this space to work on the things that we want to. And by having access and the right to participation, we can create the change. So I hope that this helps you to having a more idea of that you are able and capable to do everything you wanted to do, and you have it in you. And when you think that, no, I don't, there are institutions that will support you. You can always reach to local or international, and there are the right sources that you can just approach to someone that knows already, like competent institutions like Next Generation Global Frontier, or you can type to other organizations as all the compiles of the United Nations, or in your universities, in your countries. There is a lot, and we can be part of it, or we can always create something new. Thank you, Dami.
Wow, thank you very much for that, Stella. That is a lot of messages loaded down in that speech. I'll try to break this down with very key points. The first is the fact that as young people, we're not victims of the challenge that we are currently facing, right? How do we take responsibility? Like I said earlier, moving from victimhood to responsibility on the challenge ahead of us. And something that is also very important that Stella mentioned before we take questions from our audience is the fact that there are key things that we also expect from the present generation of leaders to help us prepare for this future development challenge. And I think you should allow me at this point to read a particular quote that I find very interesting from the head of the United Nations Disaster Preparedness Committee. She made this statement around 2020 when COVID-19 struck the world. And she spoke to us, she made this statement and she said, the current COVID-19 crisis is not the real disaster. The current COVID-19 crisis is not the real disaster. The real disaster is the failure, or is our collective failure, to invest in resilient systems and communities. So the current crisis that we're facing is not the main disaster, but the main failure would be, or the main disaster would be our failure to invest in knowledge, our failure to invest in infrastructure, our failure to invent or reinvent new systems that can solve that problem. And this essentially speaks to the essence of the conversation that we're having today, right? So Razi spoke to us about international law. Tavi spoke to us about public policy, and Estella spoke to us about the essence of leadership. And she tried to break this down with very specific things that we can do. While we have expectations from the current generation of leaders, as young leaders, we can also take action. And to take action means that you need to be knowledgeable, or you need to find knowledge. And the internet today provides the highway to have access to borderless information. So you have access to everything you want. You only need an information with one person or one individual. You probably have gotten that information right here today to elevate you to the next level. And I think this is also very, very important. And I see that there are some questions that are already put in the chat box, but I think at this point, we'll give our audience the opportunity to interact with the panelists. So our panelists have been speaking for some time now. We want to hear from the participant in the room. What questions do you have for the panelists? I think Tristan asked Estella about what organizations should you join in this regard to take action to renew your thinking on these development issues. I think she already mentioned some of them, or maybe she might also mention some more afterwards. But let's at this point give the ground to to our audience to ask questions. If not, I'll leave the ground to some of our panelists to make some key points before we move forward. So if you do have any question, please put them in the chat box. I think that's better. Or maybe we can actually ask the host, Tavis, to unmute them if they feel comfortable to do that. Whichever works very fast for us, we can do that very quickly.
Yep, so I've allowed for folks to unmute themselves. If you're comfortable, if you would rather ask a question, I believe, please do so as well. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, I think we already have a question here. When considering intergenerational co-leadership, both in the context of climate crisis and more broadly, there's been a lot of emphasis given to what youth need to upskill and develop themselves to step into leadership roles that can have impact. I believe there's a great potential for younger generations to be the teachers to those who are older and more experienced. Can the panelists comment on the value and potential of such pathways on intergenerational knowledge sharing and capacity building? This is a very long comment and question, but it's a very interesting one, right? Because our panelists just need to also give us very specific examples of what is the value or importance of intergenerational knowledge sharing and capacity building. So Estella basically mentioned that we have expectations from the present generation of leaders. As the next generation, this brings an intergenerational need for capacity building and knowledge sharing. So I would like any one of our panelists to quickly jump on this question, which is very important from the YFPFP.
Okay, perhaps I could take a step at this one.
Thank you.
And this one particularly interests me quite a bit. I spent some time thinking about this earlier this year when I was at the St. Gallen Symposium. So the entire premise for this symposium is on intergenerational dialogues, right? And it's not just unidirectional, and it's not just bidirectional, it's multidirectional. And in all senses, we're not just saying between one generation to the next, we're saying that it's a constant engagement across all generations. And the knowledge gap is not between two generations, the knowledge gap is between all generations, because we're always missing out on something, right? No one has a perfect answer, no one has a perfect solution. The expectation for youths to upskill and to learn has been something that has been keeping youths out of the engagement pool in making these contributions, but that has also been changing. One thing that I thought was really exciting, and at least from the perspective of the youth when we're at the symposium, was that we had these roundtable sessions, these breakout rooms as well, whereby you have about 15 leaders of tomorrow that's highly curated, and then we had a leader of the day, right? So we had someone from the more senior generation who is currently, sitting on a board or one of the chief executives of sorts in one of the MNCs. Engaged about 15 youths from around the world and different expertise on a particular topic. And the idea for this is not so much for the executive to tell the youths what he wants or she wants them to know, but rather it's for the youths to kind of teach that executive what's happening on the ground in their own local communities, right? So for these big MNCs or for these big organizations, they have presence around the world. But the challenges that the different parts of the world face are inherently different. And so then these companies and these organizations will also face these different challenges around the world, right? So a level of localization helps. And so the role of youths then became the role of teachers. So by these youths were telling these senior executive leaders of today what they hope to see change, what they think might work, or then what we think might be a good option moving forward, what policies do we think are a bit more obsolete or are lagging behind, and perhaps not just changing the policies, but how then do we enhance and better these policies? So the tables have turned, because the intergenerational dialogue is a dialogue between parties, right? And so I do think that there's great value for that, and we're seeing these modes emerge in various platforms too. For example, when we were in Davos earlier this year as well, within Davos itself, there's a young leaders segment whereby these young leaders would then engage with the leaders of the day, and then they would engage them on different topics, be it security, be it social, be it the economy. We see this happening in other platforms too. right? So even in Singapore, for example, at the World City Summit earlier this year as well, there was also a segment for young leaders, by young leaders within Engage, the leaders of the day, to tell them our own assessment of the ground and what we're doing as young leaders to make change on the ground. So I do think that the dynamics is shifting. It's an important shift, and the acknowledgement as well as the empowerment of it is inherently necessary. But also, I think, just to wrap this off as well, is that youths don't need a voice. We have a voice, right? So we don't need to be given a voice, but youths oftentimes need to be given a platform to exercise and to amplify that voice. So sometimes people tell us that, we're just going to give youths a voice to speak up in a forum. No, these voices already exist. They're everywhere. They just need to be amplified and be given space in an environment that otherwise would be dominated by other noise, right? So I think, just to answer that question a little bit, it is crucial and important, and I'm seeing trends of it emerging, and I'm quite pleased about that too.
Fantastic, Tavis. Youth don't need a voice. We already have the voice. We need the platform. Very important. And this is a platform that we have currently. I think Tavis, Razi can also make a point on this, or maybe Stella, if she has any contributions on this. Otherwise, we can take other questions at this time. But the floor is yours, Razi, if you have any comment on this.
Yeah, I like the examples already established by Tavis. I'd like to add one more example on the role of youth and perhaps advising further other generations. Perhaps is the Youth 2030 and our common agenda under the UN autopsies, which established the Youth Advisory Group. The Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change is an advisory body to the UN Security General on practical and outcome-focused diverse youth perspective and recommendations, and they set out some perhaps youth-centered advisory perspectives to the UN Security General, which is perhaps one of the many platforms through which youth can actually provide a very important intergenerational narrative role in basically promoting or leading climate action.
Wow, that's very fantastic, Razi. Thank you very much for that. What Razi mentioned is that currently, and as we probably would know, or we might not know, at the UN, there's a new office for youth. So everyone can Google that after this call. There's a new office for youth, and there's a General Assembly resolution to that effect. So it speaks to the relevance of young people at the UN level. So there's a separate office for youth, apart from the office of Youth Envoy. There's an office specifically now created for young people to deal with youth affairs at the UN level. And that's also very important. And speaking about the Youth Advisory Body to the United Nations, I found out about an advisor on that panel who is currently working on translating the climate change message to people in Iran in their own local language. And this is a very simple solution that she has been able to figure out, because we find that the message on climate change is written in English, right? And there's a lot of people that are left out of this conversation because of their lack of proficiency in English. So how do we ensure that this message is passed across to people who do not even understand these things? And it's the one message that the Next Gen also tries to focus on. As we've spoken about international law, there are big high-level conversations, and also part of which will be done at COP27 in Egypt in the coming weeks. But the question is, how do we bring high-level conversation to local-level implementation by bridging these two gaps, high-level conversation to local-level implementation? A key example of what I've just given on with a youth advisor I know on that panel is that she works with young stakeholders and also policymakers in Iran to translate the climate change message to young people in their local language, and gives them instructions on steps they can take. Please do this, please do this, please do that. And I think that is very important. And I think as academics, sometimes we do not take into consideration the fact that when we speak in very high-level academic terms, we leave a lot of people out of that conversation space. We've spoken about taking the conversation from online to offline today. How do we ensure that we speak to our own people in the language that they understand? I think it's also a barrier, and as young people, we're able to provide that solution. I think I can see Stella nodding there. Maybe she also had some contributions to add to this. Please go ahead, Stella.
Thank you, Dami. Yeah, well, I feel like you, Tavis and Rasi, have addressed like this first question. And what I've been doing for the people that maybe will follow this afterwards, but is not able to read like our chat, one of our attendants asked about what could be a specific platforms to look for this kind of information that I mentioned before. So thank you for this question. And I gave many resources, but most of them, if you can notice, are like cycling around the United Nations structures as the largest institution and in a global level taking care of this matter and joining different communities at level and regional and international level into the topic of climate change. So for young people, as general education as platform, there's something called the SDG Student Hubs. These are initiatives like that are supported by United Nations, but they are like led by the students of universities across the world. And if your university doesn't have one yet, you can create it. You can go to the website that I just shared with you, and basically the main task is like creating this awareness, knowledge, and also training and support to the community in your university or in your local area about like sustainable development goals. Now, if you're more focused like directly only in climate change, I also put here like the resources for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. They are like different, you can just type like UNFCCC, and then you can put initiatives or youth initiatives, youth participation, and you will find the forums that allow you to volunteer, to create a dialogue, to join their social media, to see which events are there like coordinating. And as I mentioned, like at the very end, right? Like you're doing great by following LCOY conference around the world, like not just the one from your country or your region. You can just look what other people around the world is doing and finding inspiration. Like, hey, that they're doing there, it could work here too, right? So now I go with my LCOY, and we can all work all these things together. And in November, the COP27, that is like the state level of this conference, is going to take place. And in there, like not only state and private institutions, but also like NGOs led by communities that can be like young people and vulnerable communities participating there. So I really invite you to follow it. Like most of these events, like the green events, like are transmitted in YouTube and in the websites also of the COP27. So you'll be able to participate. And maybe I will give the floor to Tavis, who also shared some extra links to you, so he can name them shortly. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Estella. So just to add on to Estella's really good list, and I noted them down, and I think we'll probably post it on NextGen's page as a follow-up for resources for those who are unable to see the chat post-event. It's just the Climate Reality Project that it's also funded and supported by the World Economic Forum. Just adding that one to the list. I think to answer Tristan's question, this is a continuation of my point. If I had to imagine an ideal platform for channeling youth agency and decision making, what might it look like, and how are the dynamics? It's a really good question. Where do I begin? So I think two really important things in terms of characteristics that I feel would be really good for such a platform. One would be an attitude of experimentation. So I think a platform which supports and empowers experimentation, and why I say experimentation is because it needs to embrace failure and celebrate a level of failure as well, right? To keep trying out certain things that might or might not work, support it, fund it, of course, with good evaluation. So allow these youth projects that has the potential to take off, properly, seriously fund it and support it, and allow it to act as an experiment, within pilot projects, within smaller communities, and then see how it can scale. So I think the dynamics needs to be one of experimentation and celebrating both successes and failures to see how we can do better on that. And the second one is to also involve youth in the policy agenda process, in your policy cycle for public policy. So I think the idea is to see that, okay, what are some issues that youth are thinking about? How can we include them in creating some solutions? And then how can we empower them to experiment on these solutions? Because one thing that youths have is energy, passion, innovation, ideas. One thing that youths don't have is money, right? You don't have the funding to go and do the things that need to be done. A lot of funding is being channeled for other things. If we're able to channel funds with this platform of experimentation with lower levels or lower barriers to entry, I think that would be a good way for a level of collaboration to happen between different organizations, or different platforms, or different generations, right? So I think some of these characteristics would look really good to me. One is to empower youths to try, and not just by saying, good job, go do it, but rather here's a solid amount of funding, experiment, try, tell us what's not working, how can we refine it, tell us the shortcomings, how can we do better, if it's working, what worked, and how do we scale, right? Fail fast, fail cheap, we've heard this in the startup world. And I think in this sense, we could also experiment that, and that could also impact a lot, have a larger impact, right? Yeah, so that's just my initial thoughts, and based on what I've seen so far, I mean, based on the different engagements I've had in different programs, symposiums, and conversations, that's something that I think is missing, which is empowering for experimentation, if I would just sum it up, yeah.
Thank you very much, Tavis, for that. I think what Tavis just spoke about, and I saw Tristan just uploading that, which means it's a very good response also from Estella and Razi, a very good one. And I think this point is very important. How do we marry the challenges that we've identified with solutions on the ground, right? With projects that can solve these problems, right? And then also look for means of financing for this for these initiatives that we have, because at the end of the day, we also need finance to be able to accelerate action on that. But the first things first is to, like I mentioned earlier, have clarity on the challenge. Like for our participants who have listened, I think I'm sure they've learned a lot. If you have any other question, please do not hesitate, because we have about 10 more minutes to end this panel session. Clarity on the challenge and create an innovation around this challenge that you have in your society. I give an example of a lady translating the climate change message from English to the local dialect. That's a very simple solution, but it goes a long way, right? Because it brings about inclusion of the people who are left out of the conversation, right? What does the next gen try to do? We work and think about research findings in international law, bring the policy also into it, and try to work with people who have projects on the ground to close this gap in the promise of international law. What Razi has told us today is that this sets the stage for action, but these are proclamations. How do we take these proclamations into actionable impact? By working with people who have projects on the ground. At this very point in time, I think I extend very good appreciation to the Young Professionals in Foreign Policy Tokyo chapter. Thank you for giving us the stage. Thank you for hosting us officially. Thank you for giving us the platform to be able to reach out to your own audience in Japan. And thank you also to our audience for joining. I've had a very interesting panel session here as being the moderator for this event. Again, thank you again to our speakers, to Razi, to Tavis, to Estella. At this point, I think we're bringing this event to a close. If no one has any other question at this point, I think I'll give the floor again to each one of our speakers to give their final words. Then we can give the closing remark to either Tristan or Lauren to give the final closing remark. Please, we can proceed. Maybe we can start with Estella first. Your final words.
Thank you, Lami. Well, I sent a message in our chat, but probably I will have to resend it again because it was sent directly. As Tavis mentioned, sometimes the thing that we lack of as youth people is the support, and especially the financial support. But I hope that something that you can get from what I shared and also my colleagues is that knowledge is more important sometimes than money. If you have the right knowledge, you will get the support, you will get that funding eventually. And even if you're like, no, but I don't know how to, well, you can also go Google, like, okay, funding opportunities for conference and climate change, scholarships about this, and that, and there are many, and not just in English, in many languages. But I think this is also a key point. We have to recognize that a common language in international level has become English. And it is important that as youth, we prepare on it in an effective and efficient way so we can express the ideas that I know that many of you greatly have in their mother tongue, but also in the common language that has become English, right? It is a platform that we will have to unify who we are and also to transcend who want to be. I would like to finish with a quote from a Chinese proverb that is like, alone, we might arrive earlier, but together we will go further. So I leave it here, and just don't give up and keep with your ideas, and hopefully we'll see you in the future in another conference. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Estela, for that. It's a lot of motivations and a lot of inspirations from your messages. Now we give the floor to Razi for your final words.
Wow, that was really motivating to hear. I really agree about knowledge, especially as we live, as mentioned, we live in an age where knowledge is not just is no longer exclusive to the top-down mentality of perhaps previous generations that would just receive a newspaper every day and they can read and perhaps influenced by. We live in a day and age where knowledge is accessible, again, as mentioned, by a click of a button, and therefore perhaps it's available to everybody in many languages, as mentioned, as well as the universal language and the ever-present ability to translate. So I believe, yes, knowledge is attainable for those who seek it, and it's very important in driving collective action that is perhaps within the common framework of everybody's goal, basically, and their right, as we might have been inspired by the human rights link with climate acts. So everybody's right, basic inherent human right to live in a clean environment. And thank you very much for hosting me. It's been a pleasure to hear everybody else's view as well.
Fantastic. Very good to hear from you, Razi. Now the floor is yours, Tavis.
Thank you, Demi. Well, that's fantastic from Estela and from Razi. I mean, brilliant points. I think just to wrap it up, I do want to encourage all of our participants who are listening in right now and in the future, that it may seem like it's an extremely scary and intimidating thing to get involved in such a huge global problem, or to get involved in such huge global platforms, right? But if not now, then when? If not you, then who? We only have one Earth. We only have all of us in this, and we're all in this together, right? I would encourage you to get equipped, to get involved, to get engaged, and to get invested, to find a like-minded community, to entrench yourself in the things that we want to do and achieve. There are a lot of people out there who are gunning for the same agenda. Get empowered, and then get motivated, and to work on the change that we want to see, right? And not just wait for it to happen. So I think I'll leave it as that. I do want to add two final plugs. I think one is that I'm also on the steering committee of YPFP Tokyo for this year's LCOY. So thank you all for being here. It's absolutely brilliant to see everyone participating so actively. And just to echo what my colleagues are saying in the chat box, is that we do have some more activities happening up and some more sessions, as well as the closing session tomorrow. So do join us there as well. And check out Next Gen Global Frontier socials, where we'll be posting some of these updates, as well as the recap sessions and the resources. And we are also relaunching and rebranding. So I'll leave that last bit to Demi, and he'll tell you more about it. And so yes, thank you everyone. Thank you for having me. It's an absolute joy and pleasure to be here. Demi, back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Tavis, for that final message. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for staying with us for over 90 minutes now, having very complex and interesting conversation. And I hope that this has enlightened you in some way to take action. Or if not at all, you've been able to get a strong sense of direction on what the climate change issue is, but essentially the fact that as young people, we need to move beyond victimhood to responsibility on the issues, right? And this starts with information. We have been loaded with a lot of information and resources from our panelists today. And what the Next Gen Global Frontier would also do is that as young people, we're not waiting for the time to arrive. We are positioning for these things. Positioning is a very critical thing for us as at the Next Gen Global Frontier, because we believe, if you allow me to be so bold to say that, goodness and mercy shall follow us. We are positioning for these things. So these things, opportunities would look for us. And that's why we have an example of a partnership today with the young professionals in foreign policy. So I encourage you all to follow the Next Gen Global Frontier on our media pages. We'll be coming up with our website very soon, and we're also rebranding. As you might have seen, there's a new logo out there. So we will provide a launch event also sometime in November. Please do follow us on our media pages, and we're happy to also have you and host you on other subsequent events in the future. Thank you very much for having us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
So one sec, sorry, I'm just gonna get Razi, Demi, Estella, just to show off your beautiful smiles for 3 seconds. I'm gonna take a really quick picture for all of us before we stop this recording and before we go off on our way. So if I could have all of you just smile in 3, 2, and 1. One more, just in case I messed that up. And that's completely on me. Okay, we got this. And in 3, 2, and 1. Wonderful. Okay, thank you, everybody.